All right. Well, hey everyone. This is David Denon here. I'm talking to CJ Sheu, and we're going to talk about film. Let me just introduce him a little bit, and we'll get started. CJ is one of the brightest young scholars I know here in Taiwan. He's currently an assistant professor at of applied English at Mingchuan University. His main academic work is on literature. He's written a book called Hyperobject Reading, Scale Variance, and American Fiction. And although this book is mostly about literature, he does discuss a little bit of film as well, the Solaris movies. He's also done work on philosophy. Actually, I first met him when I attended a talk of his on Sartre and Badiou, which was very good. Um, and CJ, in addition to all of that, is a very prolific film reviewer, indeed, a Rotten Tomatoes approved film critic. And you can check out his reviews, which have been published in lots of different places at reviewfilmreview.wordpress.com. And today we're going to have a conversation mostly about film criticism, maybe about other things as well. Just to give a little bit of background, my background is not really in film, although I used to follow film quite closely when I was growing up, when I was young. I grew up near Chicago during the heyday of Siskel and Ebert. I don't know if you ever followed their film criticism or the Siskel and Ebert show. But I also used to own big collections of Pauline Kael's film reviews and Ebert's film reviews and other things. And yeah, but that was a long time ago, all a long time ago. And aside from occasional conversations on my channel with Will Kitchen, a film scholar, um, mostly moved on to other things. But I'm very interested in different kinds of criticism, art criticism, literary criticism, all that kind of stuff. So I'm interested in picking CJ's brain on film reviewing, film criticism, and on how he kind of relates his various interests together, if he does. So welcome to the show, CJ, and anything you want to add before we get started?
Hi, David. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Um, Gosh, you're making me nervous. Yeah, no, I think you said a lot more than I would have said about myself.
All right, well, sure. Well, let's get started then. Jump right in. I'm very curious about what attracted you to film reviewing. Like, have you always been interested in film? Why have you chosen to, spend so much time reviewing films as opposed to, all the various other things that could be reviewed, books, music, all of that kind of stuff. So why film?
Yeah, so a long, long time ago, I used to be just another regular cinema goer. I went to the movies with a friend just to have fun, to watch one of those big action blockbusters with explosions. But back in 2017, I was watching La La Land, and something about that movie tickled my brain. And I was thinking about the boundaries in that film between reality and what we might call like the logic of the musical world. And I think part of it may have been because the film began with a fantasy sequence. If you remember, they're dancing around on the LA highway in the middle of traffic. And yet, a lot of the bridging sequences are quite realist. So that got me thinking, like, what's going on in this movie? And as often happens, in order to think my way through a problem, I had to write about it. And so that became my first film review. And so that kind of turned on my brain to like all the different structural things that a film could be doing. Because as you mentioned, my background is in literature. I'm focusing usually on fiction, right? Novels. So the length of a novel allows for some architectural designs. And I started noticing those in films as well. And of course, I had to do my due diligence, had to learn about filmmaking and like different aspects of film. And so that slowly opened my eyes more to like the various other things that a film could be doing, not just in terms of the structure. So I also started paying more attention to like acting and like the use of sound, which was that was pretty mind blowing because sound is designed to sort of get under your consciousness, right? To work directly on your
Mm.
emotions. So noticing that was a real mind opening moment. And yeah, and so that's where my interest began. And then I started thinking, hey, I have these thoughts. I wonder if anyone's willing to pay me for them. And the first few plays I tried, of course, I was very green behind the ears. Nobody, rightfully so, nobody wanted to take my writing. Um, but then I lucked out with a Canadian site called Critics at Large. They don't pay people and they usually don't accept pitches. But I felt like as a stepping stone to like getting more people to read and comment, that was a pretty good opportunity. And so I pitched them and they agreed to publish my writing. Of course, again, not paid, but the editor, Steve Weinberg, who's a distinguished professor in a liberal arts college in Maryland, um, edited me. And so that was the first time I had an editor as well. And it was very interesting to see not just like the use of language, but also he himself sometimes reviews films, and it was very interesting to see what he focused on or how he valued certain aspects differently from how I did. And then later on, I finally did get a paying gig at the News Lens International desk. If you don't know, the News Lens is one of the premier, I guess, the first digital-only news platform in Taiwan. And they usually publish in Mandarin, but they also have an international version, which I learned very much later is run by one guy. And so the editor is always hungry for new pieces to publish. And so the editor at the time, David Green, was willing to publish some of my work. And I stuck with the News Lens for, I guess, like 4 or 5 different editors. Um,
Mm.
from my understanding, it's a very like high pressure job, right? There's only one person full time. Sometimes they have an assistant editor, but not always. So the turnover is people don't stay too long. So I reviewed there for about 4 or 5 different editors. Four or five different editors. And at the end of last year, for various reasons, I decided to take a short hiatus. So from 2025, I'm only reviewing films that I find interesting. Like I think there's something interesting to say about it. And so shorter pieces, like the way I write reviews, I divide them into shorter and longer pieces, and then commission reviews are a separate category. Um, but like for writing for myself, right? Shorter pieces, the title is just thoughts on blah blah blah, and I try to limit those to under 400 words, just as a stylistic exercise. But the longer reviews are when I realize I can't compress my thoughts under 400, and so I write a full-length review. That takes more work because I have to summarize what the film is doing and try to like explain the premise before I really get into what I feel is interesting about it. So currently, my shorter thought pieces are published on my own blog, which David very kindly plugged for me, and the longer pieces go to Critics at Large. And Critics at Large isn't for profit. It's just a platform. So even when they publish a piece of mine, I retain full rights. So in fact, the longer pieces also go on my blog. But though on my blog, they don't get the benefit of being edited.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that's currently where I'm at. How I started out, and yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I want to ask you later on about how you think about the relationships between literature and film and narrative in different mediums and so on. But just to stick with kind of the nuts and bolts of film reviewing for a minute, when you were working for the New Lens, did you were they mostly giving like suggesting things for you to watch, or would you like pitch to them what you wanted to review, or how did that work?
Yeah, so when I was writing for the News Lens, they always asked me to pitch monthly.
Hmm.
Again, there's only one guy. They don't have staff writers. I think everybody had to pitch. Um, and what I would review, like what they would commission, would depend on the editor. So Some editors wanted an Asian focus, so I ended up watching a lot of East Asian or South Asian films that you may not have heard of. And other editors wanted eyeball count, and so they asked me to review blockbusters. And then the editor that I became closest with, Nick Haggerty, he's currently studying journalism at Fordham. He just let me pitch and review like any three pieces I want every month, and
Hmm.
I think he was really interested in uh, film and film criticism, and so um, yeah, it depended on the editor. But usually, I would pitch movies that I thought might be interesting. It's always, I think it's unethical to pitch a review after you've seen it, uh, because criticism, especially arts criticism, usually has two main roles. First is the evaluative role, right? Like how good is it or what is it doing? But the second role is like a a product reviewer. It's telling people should you spend your time and money on this thing. And this relationship is more vexed for film than many other art forms because film started out as a popular art form, and a lot of it still is. So, part of me just wants to talk about, oh, look at what fascinating thing this film is doing. But then I also have to keep in mind, like, I have to end up with some kind of should you go see it or not kind of recommendation, or at least write the piece in a way where the reader will be able to decide for themselves if they should spend the time and money. Yeah, so I usually used to pitch reviews for films that looked interesting. Uh, and then again, based on the editor, I would choose like the different films I might want to watch and review for them. But really, since it's paid by the piece, I tried to economize by pitching films that I would probably go see anyway. It
Hmm.
didn't end up being the case sometimes, but it worked out pretty well, I think. So it's two birds with one stone. I got paid for it, but I also got to increase my film education, as it were.
Yeah, right. Yeah, interesting. So, um, I'm also curious about like when you started, or maybe you could even talk about today. Like, I'm curious if there are other critics that you feel like you learned from, people that influenced you. Um, yeah, do you have like favorite critics that you like, or people that have helped you or anything like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Every time I watch a movie, I always go read the same. I call them my own stable of critics.
Hmm.
But like at the very beginning, you mentioned Ebert and Siskel. Roger Ebert, I think, was quite formative for me, as he was for many people. I really like started paying attention more to movies in college. I think, again, as many people do, even before I was reviewing things, I studied English, or I guess they call it foreign languages and literatures, at National Taiwan University. And so, I wanted to try to get a jump start on what I was going to be studying. I did my own reading. A lot of these readings talked about film as an academic text as well, not just a popular text. So I started watching movies with that in mind, started watching old classic movies. When you begin watching things that are not specifically designed for popular entertainment, it takes a bit of getting used to. And so, to be quite honest, the first few classic movies I watched, I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea like what I was supposed to be getting from it. Um, Even looking back, like some movies that I've seen, I have basically very fuzzy recollections of. Like for instance, one film I tried to tackle was Ulysses Gaze by Angelopoulos, and
Hmm.
for the longest time, I thought it was something else. Like I misremembered the film name, and that you can see that's how blurry my memory of formative the process of formation was, or it still is, in fact. But yeah, so Ebert was really important for me in the sense of he had a really good knack for capturing what an everyday person might notice or might get from a film, or like the impression that one might leave the theater with, and sort of like expanding on that, deepening it, or even explaining how the film did it. And so I guess that was really helpful for me as a kind of stepping stone into more technical or advanced thinking about film and criticism. Um, and after that, I started reading more critics more broadly. Many, many, many people are reviewing films, and for me, I think who I choose to read is actually not just about taste, because we can disagree about individual films. It's more about writing style. Like I like to read authors with a certain writing style. Um, so the critics, well, before I get into who I read now, there were two critics that were really helpful for me in the beginning of my, let's call it a film critic career. Um, One was Noah Gittell. He's still writing. Uh, he recently put out a book called Baseball the Movie, basically a review of American baseball films. I think it's American. Baseball is a pretty American sport, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, so, and he gave me lots of advice about how to pitch, how to really get a foothold into like publishing my work. And the other critic that was very helpful was Charles Bramesco. I actually got to meet up with him in New York in 2019, just before coronavirus hit.
Mm.
Um, and his, I don't want to sound insolent, but like his early work really inspired me. Because I think when he was starting out as a film critic, he was trying to capture like a market share, I guess, with some really great pyrotechnical writing. Like the words just exploded off the page. The imagery was electric, and that really showed me that because again, I have an academic background. Academic writing is often very staid and boring, but he showed me that film criticism could be so variegated, it's so full of possibility. Um, I think it's after he started publishing books that his style got toned down a bit.
Mm.
But yeah, the early stuff was really, really great for me. So currently, the critics I always check out after each film to see if they've written anything about it. I start with Matt Zoller Seitz, who is now the editor in chief of the Roger Ebert website. And of course, Ebert himself, if it's an older movie and he's written something about it. There's also Armond White, who we can discuss later. Very controversial figure in film critic circles. He's Roger Ebert famously called him a troll. Um, and I do have to say, sometimes reading his work, I do feel like he's not reviewing the film, more like he's using the film as an excuse to rant about something.
Mhm.
But he did get a solid film education and training. He apparently used to be more on point, like more of a like a solid film critic. Um, and so like even among all of the nonsense that he writes, some things do make sense, and his perspective is very different from the mainstream. If you don't know Armond White, he is a conservative black Catholic gay man
Mm.
and who lives in New
All right.
York.
Okay.
So his perspective is very different from a lot of more mainstream film critics.
Mm.
Even when I disagree with him, or even when I think he's uttering nonsense, I still find it interesting to read. I also really admire Jessica Kiang, who writes for Variety and the New York Times. But her focus is more on festival films. Like she'll travel to film festivals all over the world, large, small, throughout the year, covering the latest art house releases for Variety. Variety, of course, is the trade publication for the film and entertainment industry. So their readership is more attuned to like the specifics of what's going on in the industry. But I just love her writing so much. I often say that she's the film critic I want to be when I grow up. Like her style is just it's so graceful, and and her taste is also, I think, quite good. Um, and then I also look at um, Walter Chaw, who writes for the website Film Freak Central. Uh, Fun fact about him: his Chinese name is Zhou Yu, which is a famous name from the Three Kingdoms era. But his writing also opened my eyes to how film criticism could be made very personal. He's a member of the National Society of Film Critics, and he got there not because he writes authoritative criticism, but because he writes deeply personal criticism. He starts off from how the film affected him or his immediate impressions, and then he connects that to film technique, film history. Uh, he he lives his life like a film festival. Like he tries to watch at least 3 movies a day. Uh, and he gets into he so that means he gets to watch a lot of really obscure, uh, almost lost historical stuff as well. He's, I think, the most widely screened, as in like he's seen the most movies of anyone I've ever met or even heard of.
Hmm.
And he's still in his middle age, so he has many more films to watch in his life. And yeah, so like when he when his appraisal of a film is resonating with what I think of it, he's really able to connect that to like a deeply personal level, and it brings the feels, as the young people say. Yeah. I also like to read Richard Brody, who is the opposite of Walter Chaw in the sense that his approach is very abstract and conceptual. You know how your writing professor tells you, don't just throw in nominalized adjectives or verbs, try to flesh it out. Brody
Yeah.
often forgets to do that. He just throws in like abstract noun after abstract noun. But he is a very careful thinker about films. So, like, even if I sometimes have to struggle with what he's trying to say, when I get the point, it's usually a very interesting and important point to make. Like, for example, he mentioned in one piece that wasn't even about fantasy films. It was just like a year-end recap. He mentioned how in order to do good fantasy, it's often harder than to do good realism because fantasy, you get to design everything. And so you have to make sure everything feels real. I thought that was a very good point to make. And it explained why a lot of fantasy films don't really work.
Hmm.
And then I also like to of course, take a look at if anyone at Critics at Large has written about a film. Um, so I often read Steve's work, Steve Weinberg, my editor. I mostly disagree with him, but it's interesting to get a different viewpoint. And then finally, I like to take a look at if anyone at Bright Wall Dark Room has written anything. They publish longer form pieces. They're not really film reviews, unless they send somebody to a festival. It's usually like personal essays. Um, but those can also be quite eye-opening. You'll have somebody with some kind of life experience that connects with the film in a way that maybe I haven't thought of before, and that really opens my eyes to an entire different dimension that a film could have. Um, yeah, those are, and then of course, finally, I go look up if Pauline Kael has sent anything. You have to go back to Kael.
Great. Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, that's a really amazing list of critics and resources, I guess, for people to keep in mind if they're interested in movies. Yeah, it's been, like I said, it's been a long time since I've been really um, kind of in the world of film. So many of them I don't recognize, but yeah, that's a really interesting list. A few things I want to ask related to that, maybe. One is, so you mentioned a lot about writing. I mean, we're both writers, so that's something that's really important to us. And, a lot of times I still prefer to read. Of course, other media, other ways of conveying kind of your opinions and views and information and so on have become more prominent. I wonder if you spend much time with like movie critics on YouTube or other platforms where it's more of a verbal medium. I'm kind of asking because I haven't had a whole lot of luck with that. Sometimes, at the end of it's the end of the day, I've been writing and reading all day. I want to rest my eyes, but I still want to maybe learn something or find out about something. So I often turn to YouTube or podcasts and um, yeah, sometimes it's hard to find, like if there's a particular movie I'm interested in and I type it into YouTube, I don't very often get like a really interesting kind of response. And of course, it's often younger people. Maybe that's, doing the reviews. Maybe that's one. thing. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts or experiences with film criticism in other media besides like the written word?
Yeah, the answer is no. I don't engage with a lot of criticism in other media, but I do have lots of thoughts about this. So, um, I think first and foremost, my interest is in the writing, and that's why my scholarly focus is on fiction and novels. And as Matt Zoller said once, to be a really good critic, you can't just love films; you have to love the written word as well.
Hmm.
So, um, and I have seen video essays about films that I've greatly appreciated, but usually I think what happens is, uh, how the saying like it's like dancing about architecture, the idea that uh, maybe it's impossible to convey the experience of one art form through another medium. I always found that to be bullcrap. So, because what happens when you do a video essay on a film is you start excerpting clips, right, to exemplify what you're saying, or to juxtapose clips to try to make a point. You're basically, to take a term from music, you're sampling the movie in order to make your point about the movie. In that case, why don't I just watch the movie? Um, and something similar happens when I'm writing about books as well. It's like, oh, I start stuffing my essay with quotations because I really want you to experience what the book is like. And I have to remind myself, wait, no, they could just read it. That's not what I'm trying to do. So I feel like dancing about architecture is really what brings the value in terms of aesthetic appreciation, and like letting your own mind grapple with the artwork. So, and like if you watch some of those YouTube podcasters, I guess, where they make a podcast, but they also make a video of the podcast, and they start talking about a movie, you're basically just watching some person, uh, if you're lucky, read a script. If you're not lucky, rant about a movie. And again, like, why don't I just watch the movie or read somebody who's actually tried to make their thoughts on the film more concise and designed and with the readership in mind, right? That brings me, I think, a more fruitful experience with the criticism and therefore with the art form as well. So as a corollary to that, I don't really listen or watch podcasts either. Sorry, David. The
Yeah,
only
okay.
podcast I do listen to is The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps by Peter Adamson, who is a
Mhm.
professor of history of philosophy. I think he's currently in Munich. But and don't tell him this, but I listen to it to fall asleep.
Yeah, I sometimes listen to 19th century literature to fall asleep, which I mean I admire it, but it's the thing that but some Hawthorne is a very good kind of sleeping pill for me. Um, yeah, what was I gonna? So yeah, that was one of the kind of criticisms I had of kind of YouTube criticism is that you're often listening to kind of some general statements about a movie while clips of the movie play, and I just found that an odd and not very useful way to discuss movies. Although I have found a few useful, as you said, kind of video essays or movie reviews in
David, can
video
I ask you a
form.
question?
Sure.
So we're talking about writing style, right? You're also asking me about like why I prefer the written criticism. You mentioned beforehand that as part of your prep process for this podcast, you would read through some of your interview subjects' work. So what do you think about my writing style? And please be honest.
So, uh, that's an interesting question, and that's something we should discuss. I mean, it gets at
Because
this.
obviously I can't tell anything about my own style, right? It's always the
Yeah, yeah,
reader.
yeah. Yeah, so that gets us at, I mean, it depends what you're asking about. So it gets at this interesting split, which I do want to talk about. Maybe now is a good enough time to talk about it between kind of journalistic writing or journalistic criticism and academic criticism. Because we both work with academic or scholarly criticism. I think that's, uh, kind of our at least one of our loves and part of our job in some way. I mean, we're both professors, so that's part of the job, and we're humanities people. So we work with academic criticism, and that has its own standards, its own writing style. Um, and then you also do journalistic criticism. I don't really do that, although I do other kind of maybe more popular stuff, blogging kinds of things on more on philosophy and art and stuff. But it's still, I don't know if it's not, I don't know if it would be anything appropriate to publish in like a popular medium. But yeah, so you have these two very different writing styles, um, which is maybe like and maybe they're more different than they are for me. Like I have even. Like I think there's, and I'm not sure, you would maybe have to read like some different things of mine to be able to tell, but my impression is that there's a pretty big split between like your journalistic writing and your academic writing, which is, um, I don't know. I mean, it's a good example of that genre of that or of that style. It's uh, I don't know what to say about it exactly. I wasn't quite prepared for that. So maybe I'll start with journalistic criticism, um, which I think your voice. I feel like for me, your voice, like as I know you, just kind of in personal, private life, whatever, comes through more in your journalistic writing. I don't know if you have if that's an intentional or if you um, or if it just kind of naturally happens that way, or if you think about it in a more kind of personal or conversational way or something like that. But yeah, I do notice that your kind of, at least for, I feel like your personal voice comes through a bit more in your journalistic writing. And so I appreciate that. Um, Again, it's a little bit hard for me not having any more really a wide basis of other critics to draw on to show how think about how that compares to other critics. But I certainly enjoy reading your journalistic criticism. For other reasons, I enjoy reading your academic stuff and hearing your presentations and stuff. I mean, that's much more dense kind of writing, bigger words, bigger concepts and stuff. Um, And so that would be take a whole other kind of evaluation, I think, to understand. Um, so yeah, I guess how do you, maybe I'll throw it back to you. How do you see kind of like the two different media that you work in, kind of journalistic criticism, academic research and criticism and analysis? And does one feel like more personal to you or than the other, or is one more like have a deeper connection with your like passions? I mean, how do you kind of navigate, negotiate those two different worlds?
It's really interesting to hear you say that you feel these two genres are quite different, because the way I approach them is also completely different. For academic writing, I do the good boy thing. I have like an outline. Every paragraph is trying to make a point. I have to put the points together, prove a thesis, etc. But when I write a film review, it's really not planned out. I pick
Hmm.
a beginning, like an entry point, and then of course I know how I feel about the film, and so I have various ideas and I collate them together. Uh, and then I think, uh, what I think might be a good endpoint, and then I stop. So it's really less planned out. So like sometimes when I'm writing a review, I'll feel like I've kind of written myself into a corner. Like the next paragraph is probably going to be the conclusion, but there's still something I haven't talked about yet that I want to talk about, and so I have to rewrite a bit from there. But yeah, the way I approach them is completely different. And I think that's maybe why you hear more of my, let's call it like personal voice in the film criticism. Of course, as you said, like the academic work will have more abstract concepts. It's a different readership. I have tried to introduce some more theoretical concepts in my film criticism, but then of course I have to introduce it. I have to kind of like contextualize it, give an example of how it works in daily life, etc. So that also it's doable, but it also makes me think about, is it necessary? Can I make the same point without bringing in the theory? And so
Hmm.
often I don't. Um, but there's also another point I want to make about this, which is I do feel like a lot of academic writing is needlessly abstract, and I'm sure you agree. So what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to make my academic writing more everyday, more accessible, without dumbing it down, right? I bring in the theory when I need the theory. I talk about abstract concepts when they fit my thesis, but like just in terms of the language, like for example, when I first started out as an academic, I threw in a lot of shalls and whereofs and uh, that kind of thing. Whereas today, I just use conjunctions as transitive adverbs, not transitive, the transitional adverbs.
Hmm.
Starting a sentence with and or but. I use contractions even when it's not recorded spoken speech. I try to make it more accessible. I hope also it helps to convey my ideas more directly as well, instead of having to wade through nominalization after nominalization. Um, because of my interest in the written word, I also read a lot of writing style guidebooks for fun.
Hmm.
And one thing I remember is one writer mentioned how nominalizations are like the zombies of prose. They
Hmm.
wander around eating your brains, which is true, right? When you hit a wall of nominalizations, your brain shuts down. And fun fact, the word nominalization is a nominalization, so it practices what it preaches. But yeah, so I because of the different contexts and different readerships, the two genres of writing are quite different, but I am actively trying to bridge them.
Okay, yeah, I was curious about that. So that's interesting to know. Because I've noticed a similar thing with myself and with trying, doing podcasts and video essays and blogs and stuff like that. I do feel like has affected my academic writing. Um, I think it's also like partly a maturing thing, like when you start out in academia and trying to get like your foot in that world, you try to be very formal and use the fancy language that the big boys and girls are using. And then, you get over that hurdle a little bit. Um, or you figure out you can use that tool, right, if you need to, but then it becomes like a tool. You don't need to do it all the time. You can say things in other ways. You can make it more relatable, more everyday. Um, and so, yeah, that's interesting to know about your experience there and how you've changed, maybe been changing your writing style.
But
Um,
this focus on the written word also brings a kind of drawback as well in terms of actually writing. I have a friend who's a professor and he writes through dictation, which is
mm,
really fast, but I tried it, I can't do it. To me, whatever comes out of my mouth is not concise enough, it's not polished enough. And going back and editing it is a lot more work than just writing it out in the first place. And secondly, because whenever I'm dictating, for some reason, my own voice distracts me from the point I'm trying to make.
mm,
I guess it like I start focusing on what did I just say instead of what do I want to say next. And so for me, whenever I want to put down something in words, I always have to do the hard work of actually writing it. Uh, so I guess like this focus also has allowed me to notice when somebody is writing through dictation. Like I can tell if this piece was spoken instead of written first. And it also makes me very, very attuned to AI writing,
mm.
which is very helpful because I teach writing in college. So I can immediately tell when a student hasn't written the draft on their own.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting as well. So, yeah, there do seem to be people who can come out almost like with paragraphs in their speech. Like it's kind of like perfect paragraph almost. But yeah, I'm very much, I have to write too. I can't really, try to dictate um, and then that's the thing that I'm working with. I have to, sit down and write as well to make it into a written object. Um,
I mean, I'm trying to like spit out paragraphs now, but
Yeah.
hopefully the structure is there. But as you can tell, I still use a lot of crutches as
Mhm.
like pause for thinking about what I want to say next, etc. I think that's also why I tend to speak faster in formal settings, because
Mm.
I have the ideas and I want to make sure that the shape of these ideas are preserved all the way up till they leave my mouth. And I
Mm.
guess if I pause in the middle, that introduces other influences, like I have to stop and take a breath, or maybe I'll start second guessing my word choices, whatever. And so I just power through it. Like you should have been at my PhD dissertation defense. I was speaking 500 words a minute. It was crazy. Like I think one of my external committee members like had to put their head down because I was speaking so fast. Like they weren't able to process it that fast.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, sometimes that can be nerves as well. Like you're in a high pressure situation, you just want to get it all out there before you forget it or before you make a mistake or whatever. But going back to maybe the differences between uh, journalistic and academic criticism, the content is also different. So the style is one difference. I'm wondering how you think about the content difference and how whether you find that your work in each area influences the other, maybe in a similar way. So, journalistic criticism, as you mentioned, there's like the evaluative part, like, is this good? Is it worth your time? Is it well made? That kind of thing. Scholarly criticism, academic criticism tends to be concerned with much different questions. Like if an academic is writing about something, like they already think like it's worth the time, right? Because it takes months to write an academic article. If they didn't think it was worth it, they wouldn't be spending all that time. They're usually working with like classic um, examples of whatever medium, a classic film, a classic novel, whatever. So it's assumed that it's already something that is well made in some way. And they're more trying to, get at what does this mean? How should we interpret it? Where did it come from? Like, what's the history and all of that? So they're often dealing with like very, very different, the journalistic and the academic side are often dealing with very, very different things aside from having different writing styles. Um, do you find that there's like an influence there for you, or is that like do you find those to be totally separate things, or how do you think about those two different things that we're trying to do with two different kinds of criticism?
It's interesting that you talk about how like academic critics usually talk about like classic texts, because when I look at the papers people write, a lot of their texts,
Oh, yeah.
um, a lot of them can be quite obscure. I mean, maybe they're
Yes, that's true.
more common in academic circles, but a lot of the stuff people write about, the ordinary or the everyday person has not even heard of.
Right.
So I think to me the commonality, I think both are quite different, but like the commonality between them is that the writer is always writing about something that they find interesting.
Mm.
One of the four affects that CNI has picked up on in contemporary discourse is whenever we feel like something's worth talking about, we usually call it interesting. But other than that, I think that what I write about in the two genres is completely different. I think the main reason is because academic criticisms, they also expect you, or they, right, the academic community expects you to make a so-called unique contribution to human knowledge. Whereas when I'm watching a movie and I have thoughts, I'm pretty sure somebody has already said those thoughts before. I just want to express my take on those thoughts. And also because like I guess the direction of writing is also quite different. As you mentioned, popular criticism, it ends up on some kind of recommendation or evaluation. Is it good? Is it bad? Whereas for me, at least, academic criticism should be about what can it tell us about something else, whether it's some theory or some kind of experience or some kind of artistic technique and its effects, but it's always externally directed. Whereas I think popular criticism, at least the way I practice it, is internally directed. What is the film trying to say? How does it say it? Does it do a good job? How does it connect to the history of the form or the history of the director or filmmakers behind it, that kind of thing. So, like, um, I've thought quite a bit about what a film review is supposed to do, or like popular criticism in that sense. Um, and for this, I usually go back to a piece by the film critic Alyssa Wilkinson called "The Critic's Job and Why It Matters," and I think she puts it together quite well. And the idea here is that the critic sees something, in this case, watches a film, and they find that the film is interesting in some way. It's done something new, it's done something different, it has provoked some kind of new thought in the critic. And so they write a review. But a solid review should have at least three parts. It should convey what the, in this case, film is about and also what it feels like or felt like to the reviewer when watching it. It should say what the film is doing that is new and how it does it. Like, what is new about it? In what context is it new? And then finally, the review should say, in terms of what it's trying to do, does it succeed? And that's what I mean when I say, is it good or bad? So, like,
Mm.
you can, this is kind of a debate in academic circles as well in narratology. And this is the debate over the implied author. And the idea is in a book, you have a narrator, you have a real world author, but how do you know whether what's happening in the book is what the author intended to happen in the book? And you can't. So, one answer that some academics have come up with is, oh, then in that case, we can posit an implied author. And so everything that happens in the book is by the design of this implied author. And that way we don't have to deal with the vexing questions of, did the author really want to do this? Have they changed their mind? Were they thinking about something else? That kind of thing. I think something similar happens in film criticism as well, which is, can you tell what the film is trying to do? And from that starting point, can you then evaluate how well did the film do it? And I
Mm.
think you can to a degree, based on uh, the history of the form, like what other films with similar intentions have done or tried to do. You can tell by the at the level of technique, right? If most of the filmmaking technique is aiming toward one thing, but this little part is not, is that a mistake? Or is it a statement? And you can also tell by the history of the filmmakers. Different filmmakers will often have their own styles, or if not styles, then at least affinity for thematic content or subject matter. So you can also tell there whether this fits with the history of the filmmaker's oeuvre, or it's a new departure, or if they're doing it for money or whatever. So I try to, when I write a full review, I try to put these three parts together, and it's a triangle, but writing is linear, so you have to find like a sequence and a format for that, and hopefully it comes out well. To be a narcissist for a second, I do have to note that I pretty much like everything I write. Like when I read back, maybe not in the moment, right? Because in the moment I'm always thinking, oh, this didn't work, or I should have said this a different way. But like, after a year, 2 years, I go back and I think, dang, this person really knows what they're talking about. And it's me. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's what I
that's
think popular criticism is, or at least that's how I practice film criticism. Whereas, as I said earlier, academic criticism is trying to make a point. So, like, um, different. Oh, there's a really good XKCD comic about this. The three different kinds of academic articles, and one is um, we applied this old theory to this new data and got these interesting results. Another is we applied this new theory to these old data points and we got this interesting result. And the third one, in the context of science writing, is this is a map of every tree in the world. Just like figuring out what the data is.
yeah.
And so, like, I've written, I think, all three kinds of papers. I have a very obscure paper on the Taiwanese author Zhang Shouya, and I'm looking at her work through the lens of spirituality in Vatican II, Second Vatican Council, because she's Catholic. And it was the first English language study of her short fiction. There have been master's theses on her novellas, but her short fiction, short stories. And so most of that paper was just summarizing stuff, just to really bring it to the table. And so if anyone is interested in this author or this period of Taiwanese literature or the intersection between religion and Taiwanese literature, they would have a starting point to do so in the English language and not just in Chinese. Um, and of course, I've also applied old theories to new works. That's a big part of my focus is on contemporary fiction. So that's a big part of what I'm doing when I introduce, or not introduce, but when I work on stuff that not many people have written about. It's like, because literature is not just about the ideas, right? It's also about how the ideas are conveyed, and so even if the theory is not new, the way that a work of literature expresses those ideas can add to the theory, maybe a different aspect or a different understanding or a different direction for future research. But most of my effort is focused on applying new theories to older texts. I guess apply is not the right word here, but the idea is when you read this text according to or with an eye on this specific theory, it adds to our understanding of the theory. And I think that's where most of my academic interest lies. I'm really interested in the form of the written word. How does this book convey these ideas? Why is it in this form? Why these words? And in fact, that's a big part of what my book was about, is like, how do, in the book, I call them synthetic elements. How do the synthetic elements help express or modify the thematic elements of a work of fiction? Yeah, so that's my take on academic criticism.
All right. Yeah, really a lot of things there. So evaluation you also mentioned. Well, so implied author you mentioned. This idea of kind of figuring out what the work is trying to do, I find really um, difficult to think about, but it's obviously an important question um, having to do with evaluating. How should we evaluate something based on what it's trying to do and whether it's successful or not? You mentioned the implied author. Do you, I don't think you said how you, whether you accept that theory or not. I mean, do you have a
Uh-huh.
view
So
about the
yeah,
implied author?
I spent about 2 pages in my book arguing for why the implied author should not be a concept that we use. And I'm not, making a pioneering statement to this effect. I'm following previous scholars, but the position I agree with is if you're using the implied author simply because you can't be sure of what the author currently thinks, then what you're really doing is you're saying this is what the author thought or meant at the time of writing. So it's still the real author. It's just time limited. There's really no reason to introduce a different layer. The catchphrase here is uh, if the narrator appears in the fiction, they're a character. If the narrator does not appear in the fiction, they're the author. There's not even a real reason to have a separate narrator category in that sense. So I guess like you could call me a deflationary narratologist.
Yeah. All right. Deflationary narratologist. So yeah, the idea of knowing the author's intention, I always, I mean, when you talk about like the meaning of the text, that becomes important, or the meaning of any utterance, we think, well, what is the speaker intending? I mean, that's traditionally like part of what we think about meaning and what the meaning is. And then there was people like the deconstructionists who kind of did away with that a little bit, kind of taking the text on its own, kind of separating it from the utterer, taking it just as a text. Um, Is that something that, well, how far away can we get, do you think, from like how much, I guess the question is how much leeway do we have in interpretation? And how does that, do you think that's reflected in among different film reviewers? It certainly is reflected in academic reviews where you have people trying to stick to like a historical meaning or kind of an author's meaning in some kind, whether it's an implied author or a real author. And then you have people uh, kind of taking a more playful approach, maybe deconstructionist approach. Does that, do you notice that within film criticism? Like how much leeway do you think people we can have with interpreting a film or evaluating a film, which is more the role of the journalistic reviewer?
That's a really great question. I think, um, like when I'm thinking about this question, I think about Tom Cruise because he's repeated many times in interviews that he watches a movie a day, but by that he doesn't mean a whole movie. He goes back to favorite scenes, or like he'll watch through specific scenes through an actor's body of work. So like when we talk about interpretation, yes, you can interpret the entire work, but you can also interpret parts of the work as well. It depends on like what you're going for. And you see this in academic criticism as well, right? They take a book and they talk about 3 pages and they turn that into a paper or something. And it may or may not be related to the whole book. But that's fair game because it's part of the work. And if it gives you that uh, experience or it gives you those thoughts, then I think that's valid. So in terms of like interpretation, you know the old saying in humanities courses, like there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Yeah, I don't agree with that. There
Mm,
is no standard answer, but there are right and wrong answers.
mm,
And uh, the standard for what is a good or bad answer, I think I go back to this really old formulation by a philosopher named Beardsley. I forgot his first name, an aestheticist.
Monroe, I
Um,
think, something like that.
hmm?
Monroe Beardsley or
Yes,
something
Monroe
like that.
Beardsley. Yeah. So like he had this formula. It's uh, what amount of the evidence can you fit with like when you give an interpretation, you muster evidence. How much of that evidence, sorry, I'm screwing this up. How much of the evidence can your interpretation explain?
Mm,
There we go. So, of course, if some of your interpretation contradicts the evidence, that's a no-no. But like even in terms of different kinds of valid interpretations, the more of the work you can explain, I think the better the interpretation. Which is kind of a paradox because that would mean the best interpretation is the work itself. Um, so yeah, that's how I approach evaluation in terms of popular criticism and also in the classroom. So like when I'm asking students, oh, what do you think this means? Like the more evidence for the entire work that they can muster, I think the better the interpretation is. But it also brings us back to you were also talking about like historical criticism. And this I think is something that's on a bit shakier ground, which is another valid tangent of criticism is what the work is trying to do valuable or like important? Is it on the standard of its goals? Is it worth spending time and money on? And so you'll hear some critics say like, I don't think it works, but at least it took a big swing, right? It wasn't trying to be mediocre. It wasn't playing it safe. And that's where that comes from. But then you also have critics who will say that a certain piece of work is noxious or toxic or punching down, not because of how it does it, but because of what it's trying to do.
mm,
And to a certain extent, I do agree with that. Like some works that trade in like homophobic, transphobic humor, it's not something I would recommend people go watch. And in fact, I did write a review panning, sorry to say, a Taiwanese film for being homophobic and transphobic. And I felt that that was an important thing to say about it. But in terms of like academic criticism, it's really less about what are you saying about the work, but more about what can you use the work to say about something else. And so, like, you can do research on the most terrible works of art or literature, and it could still be valuable research, make a contribution to our understanding of the human condition, as it were. And that's where you have like sociologists studying white supremacy movements, right? Terrible stuff, but researching it helps us to understand it and helps us understand how it came about, and hopefully it can help us prevent future iterations.
Yeah, that re makes me recall a little bit a conversation I had here with my friend Daniel Tarpey. Oh, you met Daniel before, but Daniel Tarpey on video games. They were trying to figure out like what like is too far in a video game, what things are like not acceptable in video games, like what is a good game, what is a bad game. And one of the ideas we were throwing around was the idea, and I've heard the video game designer Jonathan Blow talk about this, but kind of the criteria, or the criterion that, does it make you are you a better person after you experience this thing than you were before? And there's all kinds of like nuance and complication and disclaimers you would have to add to like flesh out that concept, that idea of whether a work of art or a game or some other kind of cultural product makes you a better person or not after you experience that thing. Um, but yeah, a little bit of what you were talking about there reminds me of that way of thinking about what art does to us. I don't know if you have
I
any
think like when
any re
evaluating, yeah, I think when evaluating a work of art, there are three ways to go about it. So we've talked about two ways, right? Um, Academically, what can it help us think about? Um, like more popular form is like, as you said, does it make us a better person? Do we enjoy the experience? Do we think it's worth the experience and time and money? But the third way is, it's a very old tradition that recently Alain Badiou has brought about again, which is, does this work of art advance the form of aesthetics in general? Like, does it is it able to make a previously formless area of existence, and like, is it able to give it a form,
Hmm.
as it were? And so um, he's more talking about like art history, right? How do we go from realism to surrealism, or to modernism to surrealism to postmodernism? Each step forward is, to use a very unsuitable word for this, but each step forward is colonizing new, unformed space and giving it form in the um form of a work of art in whatever medium. And so, like when I'm thinking about any work, regardless of whether it's academic or what my intended audience would be or readership would be, I always try to think about the work through these three approaches, and it helps to guide like what I eventually decide to do with it.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. The idea about does the work advance the medium? And that gets us a little bit into maybe of a more philosophical question that I wanted to ask you about. And we kind of touched on this at the very beginning, about narrative. And is film, in fact, well, because you study both film and literature, so you're a good person maybe to get a view about this on. So narrative, is film a narrative medium? Um, does like how does narrative work in film compared to literature? So just kind of like where I'm coming from, and you touched on this as well. So a novel of maybe many hundreds of pages to kind of explore all the different aspects of a story that you might want to tell and really develop characters and all of that stuff you can do in a novel. And it might take the reader 10 hours, 20 hours, 100 hours to get through all of this, but you can get like a really rich narrative experience. one problem that I have with a lot of like more narratively driven films is that I often feel unsatisfied at the end. I feel like there was something missing. They didn't tie up this, like they kind of glossed over this. I just feel like with a lot of like really story-driven films that I just end up feeling like, yeah, there's just something like bothering me at the end. Whereas maybe like a more abstract film, a more surreal film, I don't have that problem as much. Maybe it's like more difficult to enjoy, right? It might be a tougher sell for an audience some of the time, but I don't, if it's, a well done kind of non like strictly narrative film can often be more satisfying to me than like a narrative film. And there is a kind of development there where we, started to have these trilogies and miniseries that have like a broader narrative scope. But what do you think about how narrative works in film versus literature? How well does film do narrative, or is its strength is something else?
Wow, you really asking good questions here. Um, I do have to start out by saying that I dislike prestige TV precisely because it often ends up sprawling out and exploring every nook and cranny of the story world and goes back to the character background of each minor supporting character. And I just feel like that's not what I want from an audio visual medium. And so that's how I'm thinking about it when I'm answering this question, is that when I'm reading, I'm creating the story in my head. And the words are kind of like let's call it a prompt for the story that happens in my head. But whereas when I'm watching a film, I'm looking at the story happen in front of me. And so there's necessarily a layer of remove there. And that itself already takes me out of the story a little bit. So, like in terms of narrative, I feel like the written word is the most suitable for a narrative in the sense of immersion and exploration. That's why you can have like a whole novel, like there's a novel called Mezzanine that takes place within, I think, the span of a minute. And it's told almost entirely in flashbacks and digressions. And like in real time, it's 1 minute, but then the book fills in like what happened to the character in that day or that week. Um, and whereas a movie, when you're watching a flashback, it's still moving forward linearly, even though conceptually you know it's a flashback. It's kind of how it's kind of what Christopher Nolan was playing with in Memento, right? Going forward, going backward, and it all feels very similar. And so that's why he had to distinguish the two using color and black and white. It's inherent to the medium, I think. Although, if I say inherent to the medium, somebody's going to get mad at me and therefore mad at you, because this is an older way of thinking about media studies.
Sure.
Um, like, it's maybe easier or harder to do certain things with certain media, but it's always doable, is the current thinking. So I'm really talking about my own personal experiences here. And so, like as you said, like you can have a novel and like a Balzac novel, and it'll explore like the backstory of every person. It'll go into the history of the Parisian sewers, and I'll find that fascinating if it all fits thematically, because like it's happening in my head. I can put the main story on pause while we go down this alley, and then we'll pick up where we left off later. But when I'm watching something and then we like a mini series and we spend a whole episode on some person's backstory, it feels the same as the main story. And so to me, it registers as not a digression but a distraction. And so my favorite kind of TV is episodic TV. Everything starts over the very next episode,
Hmm.
like a CBS crime drama. Right, each
Yeah.
episode is very tight, well designed, has a beginning, middle, and end, and a twist before the commercial break. I find that very satisfying. And then uh, the best is when you can combine that format, and then you have very subtle character dynamics and evolving character arcs in the background. Uh, and that's why I think the best show in the history of television is House MD.
Hmm.
Because every episode is the same. They have a very weird medical mystery. House solves it. But what goes on while they're solving it, what's happening between the characters, what's happening with the hospital, etc. I think that really tickled the right place in my brain. So, like in terms of narrative, and of course, narrative began with the word, right? We just started
Right.
telling stories. You're a music major, I recall. So
Hmm.
I want to throw the question back at you. How do you think about the relationship between narrative and music?
That's a tough question. Well, yeah, so narrative and music. Of course, music has generally, so narrative is, we think of as representational. It's kind of about something. It might not be about something real, but it's about kind of objects that we might recognize in the world. And music is, depending on who you ask, something quite different. So the theory that I often go with these days is kind of based on Suzanne Langer's theory. And this is a little bit why I was asking your idea about narrative and film. So she talks about primary and secondary illusions in art. So each medium has kind of its primary illusion, but as you said, arts can do many different things as well. And maybe the primary illusion of, so narrative, if we're talking about literature, she talks about literature as virtual history. So it's, a history, but it's not a history of something necessarily that actually happened, right? So it's an illusion of something that, could happen, might happen, maybe will happen, whatever, but didn't really happen. Of course, it can do other kinds of things. Film, she has a very like very short section at the end of her book, Feeling and Form about Film, which was something new people were thinking about. This is like 1950 or so. And people were, just starting really to theorize about film. And she wrote about film as virtual dreaming. So she said there was like a poetic component, a literary or a narrative component often to film, but that wasn't its um, primary illusion or primary thing. Like it often drew on literature. And there's a relation that it's pretty complicated. I mean, there's a a lot of nuance there. But basically, it's dreaming, where the camera basically is your mind when you're dreaming, and all these things like come in and out. These images come in and out of your dreaming consciousness. Music, to get to music, is uh, something different yet again. And she talks about like the virtual time or virtual experience of time. I've did a talk last year where I talked about it more as like the experience of change, because sound is often, when we experience sound, it's because something is changing, and change is bound up with time, right? We can't experience time without experiencing change. And there can be a narrative, you can think about change narratively, right? So change is also bound up with narrative because narratives are about change as well, but in a different way. It's like it's a historical in a sense, right? Or not always historical, but it does have to be filtered through kind of these socially constructed symbols when we're using a narrative, using words to talk about change, to talk about history or our experience, as in like a lyric poem or something. Um, Whereas music is, uh, of course, developed music is very much socially mediated, but I think the idea is that these different sounds are meaningful because they're related to our experience of different kinds of change, right? So, um, particular timbres and so on are related to our experience of changing objects, objects moving around against each other, and things like that. Things moving quickly, things moving slowly. We get different kinds of sound, different kinds of rhythms, for example. Um,
So what I'm
so it,
hearing is that uh, the written word and films can express a narrative, but that music in its pure sense, you can only make a narrative about it.
Yeah, we often apply narratives. You know, people think about or experience a symphony or sonata or something, you know, a piece of classical music without any words. One thing that people often do is kind of impose a narrative on it, um, which is, you know, maybe a valid way to do it. Um, but it's kind of a cultural thing, I think. Probably not everyone. It's not a necessary thing that we need to do. Um, and changes are related to feelings, right? So it makes us feel, and we relate feelings to stories often. So we have the feeling that someone is sad, and then something happens, and now they're happy, and then, you know, whatever we can construct this narrative based on the feelings that the music is giving us because of the, you know, correlation between different kinds of sounds and different kinds of feelings that we have. Um,
It's very
yeah, but I think
striking that we begin with emotion because I think a lot of the time film critics, including myself, also begin with emotion. Like we see a film and we instinctively or viscerally like it or not like it,
hmm,
or have a more complicated response to it. And then we kind of retroactively figure out why that is the case. And it sometimes does happen that it turns out that this negative feeling is an intention and that it's part of what the film is trying to say. There's a film from China called Winter Vacation, and it is deliberately trying to be a boring film. Things are shot in real time, but they happen in slow motion. Characters intentionally shut down interesting lines of dialogue. And to my interpretation at least, it's because it's a kind of uh, maybe not a muted critique, but like a pointed critique of communist censorship and thought control. The idea being like, why put any energy into whatever you're doing or saying when if the country doesn't agree with it, you won't be able to do it anyway. So feelings are, I think, a good starting point, and it's very interesting to hear this commonality with music as well. Right? You were saying feelings can lead to narratives being spun from these a sequence of notes. Whereas I guess you could, I don't know, do you think it's possible for a similar kind of critique to occur in music as well, where the design of the music is taking the feelings that it incites in you and like uh, treating it as a target of its critique, something like that?
huh. It's an interesting question. It's hard for me to imagine how, well, yeah, so in a way, can
By the
music
way,
be a
you can thank
critique
me for
of,
getting this episode of the podcast banned from China.
why is that? Oh, the
'Cause
thought control kind of thing.
yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if I didn't doubt I have a big audience in China anyway. So,
Mhm. Hey, if you're
um,
from China, leave a comment down below.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You're welcome. Come on. Everyone's
Sorry, I
welcome.
interrupted.
So, um, yeah. So music as a critique of feeling or a critique of your response to feeling. Yeah, I could see how that could happen. I'm not sure I can imagine an example, but
Like
you know, it kind of,
atonal?
yeah, I think it would have to be like, yeah, so atonal possibly, but I could imagine like, and I'm sure there's examples of this, but um, you know, beginning tonally in a kind of romantic movie music kind of way, right? You know, that's an interesting aspect of film as well, is how it uses music, and there's kind of a music film language that kind of, you know, the you know, the composers and the filmmakers know how to kind of build your emotion, play with your emotion through using of music. You mentioned sound earlier as well in our conversation, and I could imagine, um, you know, building up a kind of sentimental kind of music or romantic kind of music, and then, you know, having an abrupt shift. And is music with abrupt stylistic shifts like this, which is maybe, I mean, maybe that's part of why they're doing this, is this kind of critical thing, um, showing how we have these kind of automatic responses to this or that style. Like, I mean, I think film music is kind of the classic example because, you know, you hear that eerie sound and you know something scary is going to happen, or you hear these, strings in a certain way, a romantic kiss is coming up or whatever. It's kind of signaling what's how you're supposed to be feeling. And so I could, see music playing with that, shifting between, tonal, atonal, or shifting from, um, this romantic kind of music to something very different to kind of interrupt your flow of feeling and make you kind of force you to think about how you're feeling. Um, yeah, so I could
Yeah,
see that
I
happening.
remember I think there are two films that come to mind when you talk about these abrupt shifts in musical sentiment, let's call it. Like one is Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley. That one was pretty big a few
Okay.
years ago. There's a very cool scene near the beginning where you have two groups of young men kind of arguing with each other, and it's shot in a very MTV confrontational style. It's zooming in, and the music is also very confrontational, very let's call it very percussive, um, kind of like very hard hitting music. And then when the zoom reaches its apex and it starts zooming out again, the music shifts into something more mellow and like emotional, like in terms of like sentimental. And the argument suddenly becomes banter. It's like it's
Hmm.
how guys come sometimes will banter with each other and kind of neg each other for fun, and it turns into that kind of thing. And so that was when I realized, um, and this probably won't sound like a good review, but that's when I realized that Sorry to Bother You is it's a film, but even more important than that, it's a calling card for what Boots Riley he's demonstrating what he can do as a director.
Hmm.
And the other example that comes to mind is Meet Joe Black, where Brad Pitt plays the devil in the form of a lawyer. And the story is like part of the story is about how he falls in love with a human woman. And so, of course, that's a paradox right there. And so the score, I think, is very well designed to, it begins romantic and then it goes into some minor chords and it really gives you that sense of danger or like uh, um, loss, but not loss, like the danger of loss. Something precarious, I think, is what I'm
Hmm.
going for. But like if you look at it from the Brad Pitt character's perspective, whereas from the woman's perspective, it would be more like danger, unknowing danger, like dramatic irony. And I think that
Hmm.
shift to the minor really brings that out.
Hmm. And so do you think those are examples more of um, I don't know. So how do you differentiate maybe between things like manipulation, the filmmakers trying to get you feel something or another to make you more involved in the movie? How do you distinguish between things like manipulation and maybe honesty, honestly expressing kind of how the characters are feeling versus maybe something more critical where the movie maybe is trying to make you reflect on how you're feeling? Um, because it seems like those could be read in different ways, maybe. Like, is the
Yeah,
filmmaker
yeah,
manipulating you, showing like, this is what I can do, this is how you should
right,
feel?
right. So, like, I think these two examples stick out for me because they're doing something that most films don't do, which is they're using the score to make you think.
Uh,
Which is kind of why I thought there was a connection with what you were saying. But like
okay,
in
yeah.
terms of how a film score usually works, as you said, like there's some kind of line between something that fits and something that's manipulation. And I guess different people will draw the line in different places, but it's very obvious. Some cases are very obvious. So like for me, I think what a good film score in this sense should be doing is it should be like it's like an orgasm. It's pushing you just over the edge when you're close.
Hmm.
Whereas a manipulative film score is kind of like working furiously to get you there in the first place. And you
Yeah.
can feel like it's not being supported by the rest of the film. So my favorite example of a manipulative film score is there's a Taiwanese film called The Apple of My Eye, directed by Gittell. This was based on his best-selling novel. He's a romantic novelist. a romance novelist, I should say. Um, and the climax is so god dang manipulative. The score and also the montage, because it's one of those highlight reel montages. It's connected with like a climactic event in the story, and then it pushes the string music all the way to 11. And I could tell that this was not organic. Even this was before I started really thinking about movies, right? I was just a regular someone who watches movies, and I could tell that it was not. It was forced. I could tell it was forced, and yet I cried anyway, and I hated myself for it, and I hated the film even more. But yeah, like a good example of Phil's score would be something like there's another Chinese film called So Long My Son, 3 hours plus, story of a family going through the one child policy in China, and like how they deal with the death of their one and only son. And like there are moments in that film, even if you didn't have a score, I would already be in a puddle. Uh, but the score really added to that. It's like pushing me from tearful to outright sobbing. That's what I think it means to say that a score's emotions are deserved. Like it's already there. You're just pushing it a little further.
Right. Yeah. So everything has to basically work together. And it's when one part of a film has to compensate too hard for like lacks in the other area, whether it's through like special effects or, you know, really vivid colors or like an over the top musical score. I mean, that seems like a problem.
Well, like the idea of compensating, or I guess a nicer way to say this would be problem solving. Uh, it also depends because problem
Hmm.
solving is, I think, one of the main motors of creative innovation.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so, like the key example here is Godard's Breathless. Like, why does it have these jump cuts to nothing? It's the same scene, it's the same people, they're doing the same actions. Why is there a jump cut in the middle? And critics at the time were like, "Oh, this is so innovative. It gives the film energy, it gives it youthfulness." But really, the real reason is because Godard's producer had a hard limit on the film length, and Godard would not remove a single scene. So instead of removing whole scenes, he removed footage from inside scenes to make them shorter.
Oh.
So it does depend, like, what are you, like, first of all, what are you compensating for? And secondly, how are you compensating for it?
Hmm.
Um, Another example I think of here is another Brad Pitt film. And I really don't like to do this because recent revelations have revealed him to be not a very good guy. But he also did a film called Ad Astra, where he plays a future astronaut whose father kind of got lost in, uh, I think it was Uranus or Neptune, and he was sent on a mission to kind of recover him or see what went wrong or something like that. And that film did some very interesting things with sound, mainly voiceover.
Hmm.
Voiceover can be very tricky because, like, what are you adding that has to be in voiceover? Why can't a character say it, or why can't it just be implied? So, the voiceover of this film was very controversial. Some critics loved it, some critics hated it because most of it did not add new information. But I loved it because what it did was it connected that new information to the main character's subjective feelings. So we know this is what's happening. Now we know this is how he feels about it. And also because I usually don't take voiceovers too seriously, anyways. I just let them wash over me like a cool breeze. Um, but the other main thing it did with voiceover is the father character is played by Tommy Lee Jones. And so before the Brad Pitt character starts out, he watches some recordings that his father made before his signal was lost, and that kind of thing. And so some scenes will have the audio of those recordings playing as voiceover. And what's really fascinating about this is, if you know anything about documentary editing, you'll know that whenever you start seeing B-roll footage, it's because something wacky is going on in the edit, whether it's the audio being snipped together, cutting out pauses, connecting two completely different audio passages. the film does not want you to focus on the audio, so they're showing you something else. And that's kind of what's happening with the Tommy Lee Jones voiceovers. If you read the script, the his lines make no sense. They're like Donald Trump giving a speech, right? They go from one point to another point, and there's no connection in the middle. But because he's Tommy Lee Jones, he can make it feel like a natural turn. And so playing that in voiceover instead of watching him act it out, um, I think adds to the coherence. You're just kind of going with the flow. You accept, oh, now he's talking about this, now he's talking about that. And so I feel like this is another way of compensating for a shortcoming, I guess. They wrote the script like this intentionally, right? They wanted Tommy Lee Jones to play the part. In fact, in an interview, Jones said he asked the writer director James Gray, like, do you want me to rewrite this? And he's like, no, 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 I wrote it like this for a reason. And I cast you for this same reason because I know you can give a performance that brings this dialogue or monologue alive in the way that I envision it. And he did. But one of the ways that the film had to do this was through audio chicanery in the voiceover.
Hmm.
But I think it added to the film.
Okay. Huh. Yeah, I haven't seen that. So that's seems like an interesting example of maybe what is a strength of film um, in giving an experience is you can have these different layers, different experience, well, these different layers of different media really um, going on at the same time, which you can't have so much in the written form, of course. You can have, the visual aspect, you can have voices from different periods or sounds from different periods in the kind of world of the film going on at the same time, music and stuff, which I think enhances for me kind of the surrealism, like the maybe important surrealistic aspect of film or dreamlike quality of film that maybe distinguishes it from other media, or that it does better maybe than other media. I don't know. We've been talking for a long time. Do you want to have, so maybe we should start to wrap up, but do you have any last things you want to respond to? Any other things we need to mention for this topic?
Well, um, we've been talking about like my parallel careers, I guess you could say.
Hmm. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think one question that's on your mind is why am I not a film scholar?
Hmm. Oh, yeah, yeah,
Um,
oh, yeah, that was a question. Yes.
yeah, and you know, first of all, of course, because my interest was first peaked in fiction, but I did at one point try my hand at film scholarship, and I quickly realized that I'm not cut out for it because I don't have that visual sensitivity. Because, like, when I was first deciding what I wanted to specialize in, my thinking was uh, I can flip to a previous page far easier than I can rewind to a specific part of a film. So, like, when I'm gathering evidence or, preparing an analysis, uh, the written word is much easier to handle. But of course, now you just have to scroll back. It's much easier today. And yet, uh, I still feel a bit constrained by the linear monotemporal format of film. It always unspools at the same speed consistently. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, when you read something, it's happening in your head. So you get to control what's going on when and how fast. And so, like, I feel like I lack the visual sensitivity to pick up on like all of the key details or color choices or visual aspects of a film as it's playing by, like playing past my eyes. And continuing to scroll back is just so annoying. So um, I think that's part of why I can do film criticism. I watch a movie, I take my experience of it, I think about the parts that stick out for me. I do a bit of background research into its production history, and then I can organize these thoughts and make an evaluation. But in terms of academic criticism, where I really need like the nuts and bolts of it, and to really ponder the evidence that I've chosen, and really make sure that, again, going back to right or wrong interpretations, making sure that there's nothing contradictory about it. I find it harder to do that with film than with the written word.
Hmm.
So I hope that answers your unasked question.
No, that's a good way to finish up, and that would be an interesting question maybe to ask film scholars how they manage that. I haven't I'm trying to write a little bit about film recently, but not in like a huge, it's not a huge part of my project. But yeah, I am dealing a little bit with film. So yeah, I'm wondering like how much they rewatch. Do they, just go back and, rewind a little bit? And do they just watch that scene over and over? Do they watch the whole movie? Um,
And
yeah,
for the
when I'm,
record, when I'm writing about a novel, I reread hopefully just once. Like I read it the first time and then it piques my interest. And then on my second read, I will take meticulous notes. I will like
hmm,
write down literally everything. And the hope is when I'm writing a paper, doing the research, I don't have to flip through the book. I could just look at my notes instead.
okay. Yeah, I tend to flip through things a lot when I'm writing. So different ways of doing it. All right. Well, why don't we finish up here? It's been at least an hour and a half. So let me thank CJ for taking all this time to talk to me and kind of walk through how he thinks about film reviewing, a topic I know, well, now I know more about it than I did before. So that's the mark of a good discussion, I guess. I feel improved at least, like a better person for having had this conversation. And people listening should make sure to, if you're interested in film, make sure to check out CJ on Rotten Tomatoes or at reviewfilmreview.wordpress.com. Also, he gives kind of short opinions on Twitter or X, as we say
And my
nowadays.
account is currently locked, so you're gonna have to wait for that
Okay.
part.
All right. And you can read his much of his academic work on academia.edu. So if you're interested in literature, philosophy, interpretation, check that out. And I'll try to put links to that in the description. But yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.